The moon never punishes a king for choosing the wrong queen. The old high keeper whispered as the silver bells above Ravenspire Palace began to tremble without a single hand touching them. It only mourns the woman he failed to see. His words drifted through the grand hall with the quiet certainty of a truth no one wished to remember. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Yet the vast chamber felt strangely cold, as though winter had slipped inside before the first snow. Noble families stood shoulder to shoulder beneath banners embroidered with wolves and crescent moons, each face carefully arranged into hopeful smiles and measured ambition. Tonight was not merely another royal celebration. Tonight, Alpha King Nathaniel Hayes would choose the woman destined to stand beside him as the future Luna of the kingdom. Every influential house had sent its finest daughter. Silk shimmered beneath candlelight. Diamonds caught the glow of golden flames. Soft laughter floated through the room like rehearsed music. At the center stood Victoria Sinclair, breathtaking in a gown of ivory satin that flowed behind her like fresh snow beneath moonlight. Pearls framed her graceful neck, and confidence rested on her shoulders as naturally as the royal mantle she already imagined wearing. Around her, noblewomen whispered with quiet certainty that the kingdom's future had already been decided. Abigail Carter stood nowhere near them. She remained beside the final stone column at the edge of the hall where shadows gathered more faithfully than people. Her midnight blue dress had been carefully repaired more than once along the hem, and the tiny stitches were so neat that only someone searching for flaws would notice them. She had braided her own chestnut hair before leaving the small townhouse where silence had become more familiar than celebration. No maid had fastened jewels around her neck because she owned none worth mentioning. She should have felt invisible. Instead, she found unexpected comfort in it. Forgotten women rarely became targets. Forgotten women were free to breathe. "You still came," her cousin Hannah said softly, her voice carrying equal parts surprise and sympathy. Most women would have spared themselves tonight. Abigail offered a gentle smile that never quite reached her blue eyes. "Perhaps I wanted to witness the ending before beginning something new." Hannah frowned, unsure what that meant. But before another question could follow, the great doors opened. No herald announced the king. None dared interrupt the silence that swept across the chamber the instant Nathaniel Hayes entered. He crossed the elevated platform with calm confidence, dressed in a tailored black ceremonial coat lined with deep silver, his broad shoulders carrying the effortless weight of authority. Conversations dissolved around him. Even seasoned council members lowered their voices. Nathaniel acknowledged respectful bows with little more than a quiet nod before stopping beneath the great silver wolf carved into the wall behind the throne. His expression revealed nothing. Years of ruling had taught him that kings survived by allowing others to wonder what they truly felt. The High Keeper stepped forward carrying an ancient crescent-shaped blade whose polished surface reflected the candlelight like frozen water. "Your Majesty," he declared, "choose not only the woman worthy of your crown, but the one your soul can endure beside when every crown has turned to dust." A ripple of polite laughter passed through the nobles, but the old man's eyes never left Nathaniel. Slowly, the Alpha King descended the marble steps. Every hopeful heart seemed to stop beating. He walked past the first row of noble daughters, then another. Victoria Sinclair's smile widened before he even reached her. Abigail lowered her gaze, reminding herself that hope had always been far more dangerous than disappointment. Nathaniel paused only inches away from her hidden place near the column. For one impossible heartbeat, his silver eyes settled on Abigail's face, then briefly on the simple crescent pendant resting against her collarbone beneath the edge of her cloak. Something unfamiliar flickered across his features. Gone before she could name it. He continued walking. Without hesitation, he extended his hand toward Victoria. Applause exploded through the grand hall. Musicians struck triumphant notes. Victoria accepted his hand with practiced elegance as cheers echoed from every corner of the palace. Abigail remained perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She simply reached beneath her collar and closed her fingers around the old silver pendant her late mother had begged her never to lose. Then every candle in the hall bent toward her at once. A bitter wind swept through windows that had never opened. Crystal chandeliers shivered overhead, somewhere high above the palace towers. The ancient silver bells began ringing on their own. Once, twice, then again and again. Their haunting voices rolling across the kingdom like a warning remembered too late. The Highkeeper's face lost all color. Nathaniel turned instinctively toward the last marble column. But Abigail had already lowered her eyes. And for the first time in her life, she smiled not because she had been chosen, but because fate finally had. The celebration continued because celebrations always did. Even when something impossible had happened. Servants carried silver trays filled with sparkling cider and warm pastries through the crowded hall. Musicians played brighter melodies as though louder music could persuade everyone to forget the bells that had rung without warning. Courtiers laughed with practiced ease, each smile slightly wider than the one before, each conversation carefully avoiding the question every heart secretly carried. Victoria Sinclair stood beside Nathaniel beneath the royal crest while attendants fastened the ceremonial silver sash across her shoulders. She accepted every compliment with effortless grace, thanking noble families who suddenly behaved as though they had always believed she was destined for the throne. Nathaniel answered greetings politely, but something inside him felt strangely unsettled. The sensation was faint, little more than a quiet pull beneath his ribs. Easy enough to dismiss as exhaustion after another demanding week of council meetings and ceremonies. Across the hall, Abigail Carter remained beside the last marble column for several moments after the applause faded. The old silver pendant rested warmly against her palm now, almost as though it carried a heartbeat that did not belong to her alone. Her mother had once placed that pendant around her neck on a rainy autumn afternoon and spoken words Abigail had never fully understood. One day, when the wrong choice is made, do not fight it. Walk away before the world remembers your name. At the time, Abigail had thought those words belonged inside an old fairy tale. Tonight they sounded more like instructions. Hannah approached carefully, lowering her voice. You should not leave alone. People are already whispering about the bells. Abigail looked once toward the platform where Nathaniel stood beside Victoria beneath endless congratulations. Their eyes did not meet. The bells were never about me, she answered softly. They were about someone who forgot how to listen. Hannah searched her cousin's face for anger, heartbreak, or bitterness, yet found none. There was only calm, the kind that appears after someone has already made a decision too deep for tears to change. Abigail slipped quietly through the edge of the gathering while the orchestra began another triumphant piece. No one stopped her. No one noticed the woman in the repaired blue dress disappearing among servants carrying fresh flowers into the ballroom. Outside, winter greeted her with clean air sharp enough to clear every lingering doubt. Snow drifted gently across the palace gardens, settling on stone statues and sleeping hedges. Lanterns glowed along the eastern path leading toward the city below, their warm light stretching across the frozen ground like invitations to places she had never allowed herself to imagine. She descended the palace steps without once looking behind her. The city felt different after midnight. Market stalls stood empty beneath canvas covers dusted with fresh snow. Bakery windows had gone dark except for a single candle left burning inside. Somewhere nearby, a church clock marked the passing hour with quiet dignity. Abigail reached the modest townhouse where she had spent nearly all her life. Most windows were already dark. Her father had long ago learned to greet disappointment with silence instead of questions. And tonight she was grateful for that mercy. She climbed the narrow staircase to her small room and closed the door behind her. For a long moment she simply listened. After so much music, applause, and expectation, the silence felt almost sacred. Her room contained only what necessity had allowed over the years. A wooden wardrobe polished smooth by time. A bookshelf filled with worn medical guides borrowed from traveling healers. A faded map of the northern provinces covered with careful handwritten notes. Dried lavender rested inside a small ceramic bowl beneath the window where moonlight painted soft silver across the floorboards. Abigail opened the wardrobe and selected only what a traveler truly needed. 2 simple dresses, a heavy wool cloak, sturdy boots, bandages, her healer's handbook, a sewing kit, the little savings she had hidden coin by coin inside an old tin box. Nothing expensive, nothing sentimental except the silver pendant that never left her neck. At last she sat beside the window with a single sheet of cream-colored paper resting before her. She dipped her pen into ink and wrote only one sentence in slow, steady letters. You chose the future of your kingdom. I have decided to choose the future of my own life. She folded the note and placed it carefully on the empty pillow. Before the first light of dawn reached the palace towers, Abigail Carter stepped onto the northern road with one small satchel over her shoulder while gentle snow quietly erased her footprints behind her. By the third morning, Ravenspire Palace had begun adjusting itself around a king who no longer slept. The servants noticed first because servants always noticed what noblemen overlooked. Breakfast trays returned untouched. The library lamps remained burning until sunrise. Council meetings began late because Nathaniel Hayes stared through maps without seeing the roads drawn across them. The palace physician blamed exhaustion. The royal advisors blamed stress. Nathaniel blamed neither because he could not explain the strange ache that had settled beneath his ribs the moment dawn arrived after the choosing ceremony. It was not pain exactly. It felt more like standing in a familiar room and realizing something essential had been quietly removed while no one was looking. Chancellor Edmund Pierce unfolded trade reports across the council table with careful precision. Your Majesty, delegates from East Haven request your signature before noon. The winter grain agreement cannot be delayed again. Nathaniel continued studying the parchment before him although he had not read a single word for several minutes. Tomorrow, he answered. Edmund hesitated. We have already postponed twice. Nathaniel looked up slowly, his silver eyes carrying a weariness that surprised even himself. Then they have become experienced at waiting. Silence settled over the council chamber. No one argued. Across the table, Victoria Sinclair watched him over the rim of her porcelain teacup. 3 days ago she had expected laughter, wedding preparations, and endless discussions about the future. Instead, she found herself sharing every room with a man whose thoughts seemed to live somewhere beyond the palace walls. You have hardly spoken to me since the ceremony, she said after the ministers quietly excused themselves. Nathaniel turned toward her politely. Have I neglected you? You have neglected everyone. Her voice remained calm, though disappointment lingered beneath each word. You look as though you are searching for something you cannot name. Nathaniel almost answered before stopping himself. Because she was right. Every corridor he walked felt incomplete. Every balcony overlooked an emptiness he had never noticed before. Every gathering seemed to be missing one quiet presence that had never asked for attention. He remembered Abigail standing beside the final marble column in her blue dress, saying almost nothing while everyone else competed to be admired. He remembered seeing her in the palace gardens months earlier, kneeling to help an elderly gardener gather fallen roses after a summer storm while noble guests walked past without slowing their conversation. He remembered passing her in the library where she always returned borrowed books exactly on time. Memories arrived one after another with startling clarity, each one so ordinary that he had dismissed it when it happened. Now together they refused to leave him in peace. Nathaniel rose from his chair without finishing his tea. Postpone the engagement banquet, he said quietly. Victoria looked up in disbelief. The invitations have already been delivered. Then the guests will enjoy an unexpected evening at home. She stood as he reached the doorway. Is this because of the bells? Nathaniel stopped but did not turn around. I do not know what this is. He walked alone through the eastern corridor where sunlight filtered across stained glass windows painted with wolves beneath silver moons. Something drew him toward the quieter parts of the palace without explanation. His steps carried him past the final marble column where Abigail had stood only days before. The polished stone remained exactly as it always had. Yet the empty space beside it felt strangely impossible to ignore. He reached out almost without thinking, resting his fingertips against the cool marble. Nothing happened. No light, no bells, only silence. Then Captain Caleb Brooks hurried toward him, stopping several feet away. Your Majesty. Nathaniel lowered his hand. What is it? Caleb hesitated just long enough to reveal the news was unwelcome. The Carter residence sent word this morning. Miss Abigail Carter departed before sunrise 3 days ago. She left no destination. Her family believes she intends never to return. The strange ache beneath Nathaniel's ribs tightened so suddenly that he drew a quiet breath before he realized he had done so. Outside the palace windows, the ancient silver bells began ringing once more, their solemn voices rolling across Ravenspire beneath a gray winter sky while Nathaniel stood perfectly still, listening to a warning he finally understood was meant for him. The oldest truths were never displayed inside the throne room. They were hidden beneath it. Long after the palace had fallen silent, Nathaniel Hayes descended alone into the royal archives, carrying nothing except a lantern whose trembling light barely reached the towering shelves surrounding him. Dust floated through the cold air like forgotten memories waiting for someone willing to remember them. For generations, kings had preserved the victories they wished the world to celebrate upstairs. Down here, they buried the mistakes they prayed no one would ever uncover. Nathaniel walked past shelves filled with faded treaties, ancient bloodlines, and forgotten royal decrees until his eyes settled upon a massive leather volume sealed with a silver crescent pressed deep into its cover. Before his hand could reach it, a familiar voice echoed quietly through the chamber. "Some books are patient," the High Keeper said as he stepped from the shadows. "They wait until a king is finally ready to read them." Nathaniel lifted the heavy volume onto an oak table and slowly opened the brittle pages. The first entries described rulers whose names had long disappeared from public memory. Yet one repeated phrase immediately caught his attention. "Every generation receives a choice. Every choice reveals the ruler before it shapes the kingdom." He continued turning pages until he found a hand-drawn illustration of a simple silver pendant identical to the one Abigail had always worn beneath her collar. Beneath the sketch, elegant handwriting declared, "The moon oath pendant shall remain with the bloodline chosen not by power, but by compassion. Should the ruler place the crown above the soul, the moon's chosen will quietly depart, and peace shall depart with them." Nathaniel felt the now familiar ache tighten inside his chest. Every sleepless night, every restless morning, every silent hallway within the palace suddenly carried an explanation older than the kingdom itself. Why was this hidden? He asked without lifting his eyes. The High Keeper rested one weathered hand upon the table. "Because every king believes he will be wiser than the last." Nathaniel continued reading. Another passage appeared farther down the page, written in darker ink by a different hand. "The ruler shall not be punished through war, nor sickness, nor loss of land. He shall be punished through absence. He will discover too late that the one person who quietly held his heart together has already walked beyond his reach." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Abigail standing alone beside the marble column returned to him with painful clarity. She had asked for nothing, expected nothing, yet somehow her absence now filled every room more completely than her presence ever had. As he turned another page, something unexpected slipped free from between the brittle parchment and landed softly upon the table. It was an official page from the royal registry bearing the royal seal from nearly 20 years earlier. Across the top appeared a list of children identified under the ancient Moon Oath bloodline. Nathaniel scanned each name until his breath caught. Abigail Carter. The name had once been written clearly in elegant black ink, but someone had deliberately scratched it away. The mark was careful, almost professional, leaving only faint traces visible beneath the damaged parchment. Nathaniel stared at the page in disbelief. Who would erase a child from the royal registry? The High Keeper remained silent for several moments before answering. Someone who feared what she would become if the truth remained. Nathaniel looked toward him sharply. Who? The old man slowly shook his head. The records never reveal the hand that holds the knife. They reveal only the wound left behind. Nathaniel lowered his gaze once more. Abigail had never simply been overlooked. Someone had ensured she would remain invisible. Every lonely year, every forgotten invitation, every quiet place she occupied inside the palace suddenly felt less like coincidence and more like design. Before Nathaniel could ask another question, the ancient silver bells echoed once again across Ravenspire, their mournful voices drifting even into the depths of the archives. The High Keeper looked toward the stone ceiling as though listening to an old friend. The bells no longer mourn the woman, he said quietly. They mourn the years stolen from both of you. Nathaniel carefully folded the damaged registry page and slipped it inside his coat. For the first time since Abigail disappeared, he understood that he was no longer searching only for the woman he had failed to choose. He was searching for the truth someone had spent a lifetime making certain he would never find. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. But inside the council chamber the air burned with quiet urgency. Every senior advisor had answered the unexpected summons, each believing the king intended to discuss the strange ringing of the ancient bells or the delayed engagement ceremony. Instead, Nathaniel Hayes entered carrying a worn leather folder tucked beneath his arm. His expression calmer than anyone expected after 3 sleepless nights. Chancellor Edmund Pierce rose first. Your Majesty, before we begin, the northern governors request your signature regarding the winter supply routes. And Lady Victoria wishes to confirm a new date for the engagement banquet. Nathaniel remained standing rather than taking his place upon the elevated chair reserved for the ruler. There will be no banquet. Silence swept across the chamber. Edmund blinked once, uncertain whether he had misunderstood. Your Majesty? Nathaniel placed the damaged page from the royal registry upon the long oak table. The ceremony is postponed indefinitely. Murmurs spread among the council members. One elderly duke leaned forward. The kingdom has already announced the future Luna. Nathaniel's silver eyes moved slowly across the room. Then the kingdom announced too quickly. Edmund carefully unfolded the brittle registry page, his face tightening as he noticed the scratched-away name beneath the faded ink. Where did this come from? The royal archives. These records have not been opened for generations. Nathaniel answered quietly. Perhaps they should have been. Another advisor stood abruptly. Your Majesty, with respect, if the engagement is delayed now, neighboring kingdoms will assume political instability. Trade agreements may collapse. Rival houses will question the strength of the throne. Nathaniel listened without interruption. And if I ignore the truth because it is inconvenient? He asked calmly. What exactly will remain worth protecting? No one answered. Edmund lowered the registry page onto the table. You intend to leave the capital? It was not a question. Nathaniel nodded once. Immediately, several voices spoke at once. Impossible. The Northern Council will object. The Western border negotiations begin next week. The people need their king here. Nathaniel allowed every objection to finish before speaking again. The people deserve a king capable of recognizing truth before it is too late. I failed once already. I will not fail again because paperwork asks me to stay seated. Edmund stepped closer, lowering his voice. If your Majesty leaves now, ambitious nobles may test the limits of your absence. They have waited years for an opportunity. Nathaniel met the Chancellor's steady gaze. Then they may wait a little longer. Before anyone could respond, the chamber doors opened quietly. Victoria Sinclair entered without ceremony, dressed in an elegant winter blue gown that reflected the pale morning light. She had clearly heard enough to understand what was happening. Her eyes rested on Nathaniel for a long moment before she spoke. Everyone keeps saying you are chasing someone. Nathaniel did not deny it. Victoria smiled sadly, though there was no bitterness in her voice. Do you know when I realized I had already lost? Nathaniel remained silent. It was not when you postponed our engagement. She looked briefly toward the empty chair beside the throne before returning her attention to him. It was the night after the ceremony. You stood in the grand hall looking toward the doorway where she had disappeared. You never once looked at me that way. The words settled over the chamber more heavily than any accusation could have. Victoria drew a slow breath and gently removed the ceremonial silver sash from her shoulders, placing it carefully upon the council table. No woman should become queen because another woman walked away unnoticed. She inclined her head respectfully before turning toward the doors. Find the piece you lost. Your Majesty. After she left, the room remained completely still. Nathaniel fastened his traveling cloak, tucked the damaged registry page safely inside it, and walked toward the palace entrance where Captain Caleb Brooks already waited beside a saddled horse. As they rode through the eastern gate beneath the quiet light of dawn, a small boy sweeping snow outside a roadside bakery hurried toward them holding a faded blue ribbon tied around a wooden signpost. A young healer left this yesterday. The boy called. She said anyone traveling north should follow the road marked with blue, because the other trail looks shorter but disappears after the first storm. Nathaniel accepted the ribbon with careful hands, his fingers lingering upon its worn fabric. Even after leaving the palace behind, Abigail had still been quietly guiding strangers toward safer paths. He silently wondered whether he had finally found the courage to follow one himself. The farther Nathaniel Hayes traveled from Ravenspire, the less he heard about titles and the more he heard about Abigail Carter. Every village seemed to remember her differently, yet every memory carried the same quiet warmth that no royal decree could ever command. By the second afternoon, the snow-covered road led him to a small settlement nestled between pine-covered hills where smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys and children chased one another through fresh snow wearing patched winter coats. Nathaniel stopped beside a modest herbal shop after noticing bundles of dried lavender and rosemary hanging beneath the wooden porch. An elderly woman looked up from sorting jars and immediately recognized the royal crest stitched into his traveling cloak. "You are searching for the young healer," she said before he could speak. Nathaniel nodded. "Did she stay here?" The woman smiled as though remembering a favorite granddaughter. "Only one night. A little boy arrived with a fever after sunset. She remained beside him until dawn even though she had planned to leave before sunrise." Nathaniel glanced toward the small bed near the fireplace where folded blankets still rested neatly in place. "Did she accept payment?" The woman slowly shook her head. "She refused every coin we offered. She disappeared briefly into the back room before returning with a small velvet pouch. Instead, she left this behind." Nathaniel carefully opened it. Inside should have been money. Instead, he found a simple silver hairpin shaped like a tiny wildflower. "She sold this to the traveling merchant," the woman explained quietly. "The merchant paid her enough to purchase medicine for 3 families who could not afford it. When I asked why she gave away something so beautiful, she only smiled and said beautiful things are useless if kindness cannot travel with them." Nathaniel stared silently at the delicate hairpin resting across his palm. He realized he had never seen Abigail wear expensive jewelry inside the palace because every treasured possession she owned had likely become someone else's hope long before anyone noticed it was gone. By evening, the royal party reached another mountain village where a tiny schoolhouse overlooked a frozen creek. The teacher welcomed them warmly after hearing Nathaniel describe the woman he sought. "Miss Carter spent 2 afternoons here," she said. "She taught our children how to clean small cuts properly and left us pages of handwritten remedies for the winter." As they spoke, a little girl no older than 8 wandered over carrying a faded wool doll tucked beneath one arm. She looked curiously at Nathaniel before asking, "Are you Abigail's friend?" Nathaniel hesitated. "I hope I still can become one." The little girl considered his answer carefully. "She cried once." Nathaniel looked down at her. "Only once?" The child nodded. "I woke up early because I could not sleep. She was sitting beside the creek before sunrise. She thought everyone else was still asleep." Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. Why was she crying? The little girl hugged the doll a little closer. She kept saying she was foolish for waiting so long to be seen. Those words struck Nathaniel harder than any accusation ever could. Abigail had hidden her tears so carefully that even inside the palace no one had witnessed them. Yet a child in a forgotten mountain village had. As dusk settled across the hills, Captain Caleb Brooks guided his horse beside the king. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "every mile teaches us something new about her." Nathaniel looked toward the winding northern road disappearing between towering pines. "No," he answered softly. "Every mile teaches me something new about myself." Before either man could continue, an elderly traveler emerged from the forest carrying a bundle of firewood across his shoulders. After recognizing Nathaniel, he smiled gently. "If you are following Miss Carter," he said, "do not judge Frost Hollow by its size." He adjusted the heavy bundle before continuing. "Years ago, I would not be standing here without her." Nathaniel stepped closer. "You know her?" The old man nodded. "More than you realize." His eyes settled thoughtfully upon the king. "And before you meet her again, there is something you deserve to know. Abigail did not save only strangers. Long before anyone remembered her name, she quietly saved mine." The old traveler introduced himself as Thomas Granger, a retired miller whose weathered hands carried the quiet strength of someone who had spent a lifetime building more than he owned. He rested the bundle of firewood against a pine stump before speaking again. "5 winters ago, I lost my wife," he said softly. "After that, I stopped caring whether I lived long enough to see another spring." Then one afternoon a young woman arrived carrying a basket of bread she could barely afford herself. She sat with me until sunset and listened while I spoke about my wife for the first time in months. Thomas smiled toward the distant mountains. She never tried to fix my grief. She simply refused to let me carry it alone. Nathaniel Hayes remained silent, feeling every word settle deeper than the last. Thomas continued. The next morning she repaired the broken roof over my mill because she said rain should never be allowed to steal memories from a home. She left before anyone woke up. She never told anyone she had been there. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. She never told me any of that. Thomas gave him a kind but knowing look. Some people spend their lives being seen. Abigail spent hers making certain everyone else was. He lifted the firewood once more before pointing toward the narrow mountain road ahead. Frost Hollow is only another hour from here. When you arrive, do not expect them to welcome your crown. They have already chosen the kind of person they trust. As evening settled across the valley, Nathaniel and Captain Caleb Brooks finally reached the wooden bridge leading into Frost Hollow. Snow rested peacefully upon the rooftops, and warm light glowed behind every cottage window. Before either man crossed the bridge, they noticed villagers quietly gathering along the road. They carried no weapons, no one shouted. Bakers, carpenters, teachers, farmers, children, and grandparents simply stood together beneath the falling snow with calm expressions that held neither fear nor hostility. Samuel Reed stepped forward from the front of the gathering, his walking stick leaving shallow marks in the fresh snow. "Welcome back," he said to Thomas before turning toward Nathaniel. "And welcome to Frost Hollow, Your Majesty." Nathaniel inclined his head respectfully. "I have come to see Abigail Carter." Samuel nodded once. "We know why you came." Nathaniel waited. Samuel looked toward the cottages behind him before answering. "You may enter the village." Relief flickered briefly across Nathaniel's face until Samuel quietly added, "But you may not see Abigail tonight." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "May I ask why?" Samuel smiled gently, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. "Because today she laughed." The simple sentence struck Nathaniel harder than any accusation could have. Samuel continued, "Not the polite smile she used to offer strangers. Not the quiet expression people mistake for happiness. She truly laughed. The children convinced her to build snow lanterns beside the lake. And for the first time since she arrived, she forgot to look over her shoulder." Nathaniel said nothing. Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "For years she waited for someone in your palace to notice she was disappearing a little more each day. Here, she finally stopped waiting." The village elder rested one hand upon the wooden bridge. "If I allow you to stand before her tonight, you will bring back questions she has only just begun to leave behind." Nathaniel looked toward the warm lights shining through the village windows. Somewhere beyond them, faint laughter drifted across the crisp winter air. He realized he had never once heard Abigail laugh like that inside Ravenspire. Not once. After a long silence, he nodded. "Then I will wait." Samuel studied him carefully. Most kings are unaccustomed to hearing that word. Nathaniel offered a weary smile. Most kings have never spent 3 days discovering how little they truly understood. Samuel gestured toward a small guest cabin overlooking the frozen lake. "Stay there tonight. Tomorrow will decide nothing. But tomorrow will reveal whether you came here seeking forgiveness, or whether you came prepared to become the man worthy of asking for it." As darkness settled over Frost Hollow, Nathaniel stood quietly outside the cabin and looked across the moonlit lake. On the opposite shore, he could just make out Abigail surrounded by children placing tiny lanterns inside the snow. A clear, joyful laugh carried across the frozen water, gentle enough to vanish with the wind, yet powerful enough to break the last illusion Nathaniel had been holding onto. He had spent years believing he had given the kingdom everything it needed. Standing there beneath the silent stars, he finally understood that he had never once given Abigail the one thing she had quietly hoped for all along, to be truly seen. Morning arrived quietly over Frost Hollow, painting the frozen lake with soft bands of gold that slowly chased away the blue shadows of dawn. Nathaniel Hayes had barely slept, not because the guest cabin was uncomfortable, but because the laughter he had heard across the lake the night before refused to leave his thoughts. It echoed through every memory of the palace, forcing him to confront a painful truth. In all the years Abigail Carter had lived within the walls of Ravenspire, he could remember her smiling politely, speaking gently, and serving others without complaint. But he could not remember hearing her laugh. Not once. After sunrise, Samuel Reed found Nathaniel already outside, splitting a stack of firewood beside the community hall. The old man watched silently for several minutes before speaking. "You are improving." Nathaniel smiled faintly without stopping his work. "Yesterday I ruined half the logs. Today you only ruined 2. Nathaniel laughed quietly, accepting the correction without embarrassment. Samuel nodded with quiet approval. "Good." Pride learns very slowly. Before either man could continue, the village school bell rang softly across Frost Hollow. Children hurried toward the small classroom carrying books beneath their arms while Abigail crossed the village square with a basket filled with fresh bread and herbal supplies. She noticed Nathaniel immediately. This time she did not turn away. Instead, she continued walking until only a few feet separated them. For several moments neither spoke. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and warm bread between them. Finally Nathaniel set the axe aside and faced her completely. "Thank you for allowing me to stay." Abigail looked toward the neatly stacked firewood before answering. "Samuel made that decision. You could have asked him to send me away." "I could have." Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. "Why did you not?" Abigail considered the question longer than he expected. "Because everyone deserves the opportunity to become someone better than they were yesterday." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Then I owe you more gratitude than I know how to express." Abigail looked at him carefully. "Gratitude is easy." She paused. "Change is difficult." Those words lingered between them. Nathaniel drew a slow breath. "I have replayed that night 100 times." Abigail remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I kept asking myself when everything began falling apart." He smiled sadly. "I finally realized nothing fell apart that night. I simply noticed too late what had already been breaking for years." Abigail's blue eyes softened, though sadness remained within them. "You finally saw the silence." Nathaniel nodded. "And I realized I helped create it." He hesitated before speaking again. "I am sorry, Abigail, not because you left. Because I made you believe leaving was your only path toward peace." Abigail closed her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. "I believe your regret." Hope flickered across Nathaniel's face. Then she quietly continued, "But believing your regret is not the same as trusting your change." The hope remained, though it became quieter, steadier. Nathaniel accepted her words without argument. "That is fair." Abigail studied him with gentle curiosity. "The man I knew inside the palace would have defended himself by now." The man inside the palace believed explanations could erase pain. Nathaniel answered softly, "This journey has taught me they cannot." Abigail looked toward the children laughing outside the schoolhouse. "Do you know why I stayed here?" Nathaniel shook his head. "Because no one asked me who I was supposed to become." She smiled faintly. "They only cared about who I chose to be each day." Nathaniel followed her gaze toward the villagers beginning another ordinary morning together. "I think I spent too many years trying to become a great king." Abigail looked back at him. "And forgot to become a good man first." Nathaniel did not deny it. Instead, he nodded once with quiet honesty. "Yes." A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer filled with accusation but with possibility. Before turning toward the schoolhouse, Abigail spoke one final sentence. "I stopped waiting for you a long time ago." Nathaniel lowered his head, accepting the truth without resistance. Then Abigail's voice softened. "That does not mean I have stopped believing people can change." She walked away without looking back, leaving Nathaniel standing beneath the bright winter sky. For the first time since she disappeared from the palace, he no longer hoped she would return with him. He hoped only that, one ordinary day at a time, he might become the kind of man she would choose to walk beside of her own free will. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm unlike anything Nathaniel Hayes had ever known inside the palace. No council bells announced the morning. No servants prepared schedules for the hours ahead. The village simply awakened with the rising sun and everyone worked because someone else needed them. Nathaniel chose to remain, not because anyone had asked him to, but because leaving now would have been nothing more than another escape. Samuel Reed seemed to understand that better than anyone. Instead of offering encouragement, the old man offered responsibility. Come with me, he said before sunrise on the third morning. They stopped beside a weathered farmhouse where an elderly carpenter named Walter Dawson examined a collapsed storage fence buried beneath fresh snow. Walter glanced at Nathaniel without the slightest hint of ceremony. Samuel tells me you want to become useful. Nathaniel smiled faintly. I am trying. Walter handed him a hammer and a bundle of wooden posts. Good. Then stop trying and start working. The task proved harder than Nathaniel expected. His first measurement was uneven. The second post leaned noticeably to one side. By midday, an entire section of the fence had to be removed because he had secured it incorrectly. Walter folded his arms and quietly shook his head. You built it quickly because you wanted to finish. Nathaniel looked at the crooked line of timber before him. You are right. People who build for applause always hurry. Walter handed him another post. People who build for others take their time. Nathaniel pulled the entire section apart and started again without complaint. Nearby, Abigail walked past carrying fresh bread to an elderly widow. She slowed for only a moment as she noticed Nathaniel patiently rebuilding the same section he had already completed once. He did not sigh. He did not blame the tools. He simply listened as Walter corrected each mistake. Abigail continued walking, though a quiet thought remained with her longer than she expected. That afternoon, a little girl named Lily skipped beside Abigail on the snowy path leading back from the clinic. Do you know something? She asked with a grin. Abigail smiled. What is it? Lily pointed toward the distant farmhouse where Nathaniel was still working beneath the pale winter sky. He is always the first person outside every morning. Abigail glanced toward the hill. Is he? Lily nodded enthusiastically. Sometimes I wake up early because I help my mother bake bread. He is already carrying water before the sun comes up. She lowered her voice as though sharing an important secret. I think he hopes you will notice. Abigail did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Nathaniel straighten another fence post before checking it twice to make certain it stood perfectly level. He had once ruled thousands of people with absolute confidence. Now he accepted instructions from an old carpenter half his age without a trace of pride. That evening dark clouds gathered once again beyond the western mountains, and a strong winter wind swept across Frost Hollow. Villagers moved quickly from house to house securing shutters, bringing livestock into warm barns, and stacking extra firewood beneath covered porches. Before anyone could ask for help, Nathaniel was already carrying heavy grain sacks into the community storehouse alongside the other men. When one of the younger workers slipped while pushing a loaded cart through the snow, Nathaniel reached out immediately, steadying both the cart and the young man before either toppled into the drift. The grateful worker smiled. Thank you. Nathaniel simply nodded. Tomorrow you can help someone else. From across the square, Abigail quietly watched the exchange before returning to the clinic. Samuel stepped beside her, following her gaze without saying a word. After a long silence, he smiled gently. You are watching him now. Abigail looked down at the basket in her hands. Perhaps. Samuel chuckled softly. No. He looked toward Nathaniel as the wind continued to strengthen. Not perhaps. Abigail remained silent, but she did not deny it. High above the valley, the first deep rumble of thunder rolled across the snow-covered mountains as another winter storm approached. This time, however, Nathaniel no longer stood in Frost Hollow as a king searching for forgiveness. He stood beside ordinary people who had slowly accepted him as one of their own. And without realizing it, he had already taken the first true step toward becoming the man Abigail had once quietly hoped he could be. The storm reached Frost Hollow just after sunset, carrying powerful winds that swept across the valley and buried the narrow roads beneath thick waves of fresh snow. Families hurried to secure shutters while neighbors moved quietly from cottage to cottage, making certain no one would face the freezing night alone. Nathaniel Hayes worked beside the villagers without hesitation, helping reinforce rooftops, carrying firewood to elderly homes, and clearing narrow paths so families could reach one another if needed. There were no royal commands, no formal ceremonies, and no one treating him differently because he had once worn a crown. He welcomed that more than he expected. Hours later, the storm finally began to weaken. Exhausted villagers gathered inside the community hall where warm soup simmered above the fireplace and children slowly drifted to sleep beside their parents. Abigail Carter moved from family to family, checking on older residents, replacing fresh bandages where necessary, and quietly reassuring worried mothers that everyone had come safely through the night. As she finished organizing her medical supplies, she noticed Nathaniel sitting alone near the doorway, carefully repairing a broken wooden toy a little boy had accidentally dropped during the storm. The child waited patiently beside him while Nathaniel sanded one rough edge with surprising concentration. A few moments later, he handed the toy back with an apologetic smile. "It is not perfect," he admitted. The little boy hugged it tightly anyway. "It is better than before." Those simple words lingered in the quiet room long after the child ran back to his family. Abigail stepped outside into the crisp winter air where the clouds had finally parted, revealing a sky filled with bright stars reflected across the frozen lake. A few moments later, the cabin door opened behind her. Nathaniel joined her, leaving several respectful feet between them. Neither spoke immediately. They simply watched moonlight shimmer across the untouched snow. Finally, Nathaniel reached inside his coat and slowly removed the royal signet ring, the symbol every ruler of Ravenspire had carried for generations. He looked at it for several quiet moments before placing it gently upon the wooden railing beside them. Abigail looked down at the ring, then back at him with quiet surprise. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel answered without looking away from the silver crest engraved upon its surface. "For most of my life I believed this made me worthy of being followed." He smiled sadly. "Instead, it convinced me that people would always remain where I left them." He took a slow breath. "If my pride as king is the reason I failed to see you, then I no longer wish to hide behind it." Abigail studied him carefully. "You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities." Before Nathaniel could answer, Samuel Reed quietly stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. He looked at the ring resting on the railing, then calmly picked it up and placed it back into Nathaniel's hand. "A good king does not leave his people behind," Samuel said gently. "Your kingdom still needs its ruler." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "I know." Samuel smiled warmly. "But it needs the man standing here far more than it needs the proud young king who once sat upon the throne." The old man closed Nathaniel's fingers around the ring. "Return when the time is right. Rule with the humility you learned here. Then every road that brought you to this village will have been worth walking." Samuel quietly stepped back inside, leaving them alone once again. Abigail looked toward the frozen lake before turning back to Nathaniel. "I am not ready to pretend the past never happened." Nathaniel nodded. "Neither am I. Some wounds heal slowly. Then I will be patient." She searched his face for the certainty that once belonged to a king accustomed to immediate obedience. Instead, she found quiet sincerity and a willingness to wait without demanding an answer. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Not because every hurt had disappeared. Not because every question had been answered. But because, for the first time, the choice belonged entirely to her. Nathaniel gently held her hand, careful not to tighten his grip, understanding that trust could never be claimed, only protected. Above the valley, the ancient silver bells echoed softly across the mountains, no longer carrying the sorrow of something lost, but the quiet promise of something finally beginning. As dawn slowly approached beyond the eastern peaks, Nathaniel and Abigail turned together toward the village instead of the palace, knowing the road ahead would demand patience, honesty, and countless ordinary days. Yet neither feared that journey anymore, because the greatest choice between them had already been made freely, and this time, neither of them intended to walk it alone.